The bread was still warm when they handed it to her. Steam curled from the cracked surface, carrying the smell of yeast and firewood across the dry Texas air. The Japanese nurse hesitated, her fingers hovering above the rough wooden table, eyes locked on the stranger who placed it there, an American cowboy with dust on his boots and flour on his hands. He said something she didn't understand, but his tone held no mockery, only routine. Behind her, other women stared. Some stiffened, some swallowed hard. All of them had been told this land was ruled by demons, men who would starve them, beat them, break them. Instead, they stood inside a converted ranch kitchen, sunlight slipping through plank windows as a rancher sliced open a loaf he'd made before dawn. Butter followed, real butter. Her stomach twisted, from hunger, from disbelief, from shame. In her world, surrender meant erasure. Bread like this was for families, not prisoners. Yet here it was, still warm, still real. And suddenly, everything she thought she knew about the war began to tremble. The trembling did not come from fear, not this time, but from the quiet confusion of warmth, the kind that did not belong in a prison camp. The truck that had brought them rumbled away, leaving behind a trail of pale dust that hung above the dirt road like a fading memory. Before them stretched a land that did not feel like captivity at all. No bombed skyline, no shattered concrete, only open fields rolling toward a pale horizon, tall grass waving like a field of unbothered breath, and a white ranch house standing stubbornly intact beneath a wide Texas sky. They stood there, a line of women in faded uniforms, boots still caked with soil from another continent, hands clenched instinctively as if waiting for commands that never came. Barbed wire framed the perimeter, curled and sharp, reminding them this was no illusion. Guards stood posted at the distance, rifles slung over shoulders, casual, almost bored. The women had been expecting eyes full of hatred. Instead, most eyes did not linger long enough for hatred to form. She was among them, the Japanese nurse, her posture rigid, back straight as her training had demanded. Even now, even here. Her hands were folded before her as if preparing to give a report. Her mind ran through everything she had been told. America was a land of savages. Cowboys were supposed to be wild, brutal men with little patience for prisoners, especially women in enemy uniforms. She had prepared herself for being shouted at, for being shoved, for the erasure of dignity. None of it came. Instead came the smell. Not smoke from burning cities, not the sharp tang of antiseptic, but something thick and slow and human. Yeast, heat, wheat. It floated across the yard like a ghost from another life. Some of the women lifted their heads without realizing. Others lowered them deeper, as if ashamed of the impulse. Hunger had trained them to be cautious, even with air. The ranch buildings stood in measured silence. A stable on one side, a long wooden hall on the other, and in the center, a low structure with a small chimney exhaling lazy curls of smoke. "A kitchen," someone whispered. It sounded absurd. Why would a prison camp need a kitchen like that? They were directed toward it not with force, but with hands gesturing calmly, a few words spoken in English they did not understand. Feet shuffled. Gravel crunched. Their steps echoed lightly, hesitant, as if each movement might break the moment. The door creaked open. Heat met them. A dry, steady warmth that wrapped around their cold skin, their damp uniforms, their thin ribs. Inside, the air was thick with flour dust dancing in golden shafts of sunlight from the windows. Wooden tables ran along one wall, and beside them stood men they had only seen in films or rumors. Cowboys, wide hats discarded on hooks, sleeves rolled to elbows, hands white with flour. Not soldiers, or at least not the kind they expected. One of them turned as they entered, a tall man with sunburnt skin and eyes, narrowed more from light than suspicion. His apron was stained with dough, his fingers heavy with it. He nodded once, like greeting neighbors, and went back to kneading. Press, fold, turn, again. His movements were unhurried, familiar, as if war had found a hole in the world and spared this corner on purpose. Some of the women looked away. Others could not stop staring. A tray came out of the oven then, metal clinking against stone. The sound was sharp, real. On it lay loaves of bread, not military rations, not compressed cubes, real, uneven, cracked crust bread, the kind made by hands that remembered home. He sliced into one without looking at them, steam rising like a confession. Butter was fetched. It was placed in a small dish, already soft. She watched the knife move, watched the crust crack, watched the pale center open like a quiet wound. Her stomach clenched so hard she felt it in her spine. She had not smelled bread like that since before sirens had become morning and night. A piece was set before her, on a plate, not tossed, not shoved, placed. He said something in a low drawl. She did not understand the words, but she understood the intention behind them. Eat. Her fingers hovered, not from fear of poison, but from shame. And in that moment, as her fingers trembled above a meal she had been told she would never deserve, she realized that this ranch was not simply a camp. It was a collision, a slow, silent collision between two worlds that had never planned to understand each other. The ovens did not roar, they hummed, and the war outside them, with all its noise and cruelty, suddenly felt very far away. Yet years before this quiet collision in Texas, her world had been forged in a place where silence meant submission and obedience passed for virtue. She could still see the training yard behind the military hospital in Osaka, its gravel raked flat every morning before the women assembled. They stood in rows, as straight as the flagpoles that towered above them, their white armbands tight, their backs rigid with purpose. The instructors spoke not of medicine, but of devotion, not of care, but of duty. They were told that their work was an extension of the blade, that their hands would heal only so that soldiers could return to die again in the service of the emperor. Each lesson began the same way. Heads bowed, oaths whispered, the words of Bushido repeated like prayer. Surrender was a stain that could never be washed clean. To be captured was not simply failure, but erasure. A soldier lost his honor, a nurse lost her soul. Death, they were told, was not to be feared. Dishonor was. She had been only a schoolgirl when war thickened into air you could not escape breathing. Lessons shifted from literature to first aid, from poetry to discipline. They learned how to pack wounds quickly, how to clean blood without hesitation, how to look away from pain that was not permitted to slow the machine. In the lecture halls, posters hung on the walls, brilliant and cruel in bright colors. American soldiers drawn as grotesque beasts, their teeth exaggerated, eyes wild, hands claw-like. They were shown films of supposed enemy atrocities, faces twisted, voices filled with hatred, each image another brick in a wall they were never meant to question. Her decision to become a nurse had not initially been heroic, it had been practical. Her father, already weakened by factory fumes and ration shortages, could no longer work full shifts. Her mother stitched uniforms at night until her hands swelled and cracked. The war did not ask for volunteers then. It demanded what it needed. A nurse's training offered extra food rations, a chance to be useful, and above all, a form of honor that did not require her to carry a rifle. Care was considered a softer duty, but still a sacred one. She told herself she was serving life, not death. But the system made no such distinction. In the hospital tents, near the edges of cities already half destroyed by air raids, she learned what their teachings truly meant. Officers barked orders without looking at faces. Injured men were prioritized not by pain, but by usefulness. Those too far gone were moved aside. She watched young soldiers younger than her bleed into dirt, their eyes wide with fear, not for death, but for being remembered without glory. Yet even then she was told it was noble, necessary, beautiful even. And through all of this ran one unshakable thread. Americans were not to be seen as human. Stories circulated like whispered infections. If captured, she would be paraded, humiliated, starved deliberately, used and discarded. Senior nurses warned them not to swallow pills given by Americans, not to trust water, not to believe calm voices. Every kindness would be a trick, every softness a preparation for cruelty. When she first signed the papers to serve at the front, pen trembling slightly in her hand, she did not see herself as a captive someday. She saw herself as part of a long line of women offering their strength in quiet places while men chased glory out loud. She expected loneliness. She expected blood. She expected to die bending over a stretcher. But never this, never a kitchen filled with flour dust, never the scent of fresh bread, never the voice of an American cowboy saying nothing, doing more. The world she had been taught to hate had begun as ink on posters, then as grainy images on a flickering screen, then as rumors whispered under dim lights. But it had never been real until the moment that loaf of bread had been placed before her. And that reality did not scream. It did not snarl. It simply existed, warm and impossible in her hands. And deep inside her, far beneath discipline and dogma, a dangerous thought had begun to form. If this was the enemy they had warned her about, then what else had they lied about? It was a question that had begun to whisper long before the bread and butter, in the final days of the war, when the sky itself seemed to turn against them. The front line wasn't a line anymore. It was a blur, unraveling faster than the commanders could invent lies to explain it. Orders arrived late, if they arrived at all. Retreats were disguised as strategic repositioning, and victory was still promised with the same empty certainty, even as Allied planes darkened the skies like wings of judgment. She had been stationed at a field hospital south of Manila, treating wounds with dwindling supplies and increasing despair. For weeks, they moved from makeshift shelters to jungle clearings, each site more vulnerable than the last. At night, she could hear the wounded crying into their bandages, and during the day, she watched as fellow nurses began to vanish, reassigned, captured, or simply disappeared. Their uniforms hung looser by the day. Meals came in fistfuls of rice, stretched thin with salt water and silence. Commanders still barked at them, still demanded reverence and efficiency, but their eyes had changed. There was no more steel in them, just fear wrapped in rhetoric. When the final collapse came, it wasn't with an explosion. It came with a silence. The soldiers who were supposed to protect them had already fled in the night, leaving behind rifles jammed with rust and canteens emptied days ago. When the American patrol found them, crouched beneath tarps and mosquito nets, no one reached for a weapon. There were none. She was too tired to be afraid. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the effort it took to raise them. They did not speak when the Americans approached. None of the women did. They simply stood, shoulders hunched, eyes down. The world spun slowly. A soldier gestured for them to come forward. His uniform was clean, his boots shined. He did not shout. He offered water. She stared at the canteen as though it were a hallucination. That was the moment it happened. Her surrender, not a decision, not even a conscious choice. Her legs moved on their own, forward, across the line where ideology had once stood. No gunfire, no disgrace screamed into her face. Just the shuffling of boots behind her, the sound of metal clinking as the Americans collected their medical kits, their bags, their useless insignia. She sat down on a fallen tree, barely able to keep herself upright. In her pocket was the small piece of cloth embroidered with her family crest, a keepsake her mother had sewn into her uniform before departure. She ran her thumb across it now, and for the first time since she left home, she began to weep. But it was not fear that poured out of her. It was shame, a shame so thick it clogged her throat, so deep it burned her skin from the inside. She was still alive, and that fact alone made her, in the eyes of everything she had ever been taught, unforgivable. The Bushido code was clear. Better to die than surrender. Better to fall on your own blade than kneel. And yet here she was, fed, not beaten, cared for, not humiliated, her wounds cleaned by strangers whose language she could not speak. It felt obscene. In the days that followed, she would not meet anyone's gaze. When the other women spoke, timid, hushed, fractured, she remained silent. Her silence was not stoicism, it was mourning. Not for those she had lost, but for the version of herself that was supposed to die with honor. They were marched to the coast, then placed aboard a ship. The hold was dark, but not cruel. They were not packed like cattle. They were not shouted at. Food was placed in their hands 3 times a day. Bread again, soup that did not taste of defeat. But she could not taste anything. Not really. She was a ghost now, a ghost in a body that still breathed. In the quiet corners of her mind, she began to understand something even darker than defeat. That her survival had cost her everything she thought had given her life meaning, because she was not a nurse, not a soldier, not even a prisoner. She was something far more unbearable, a living disgrace. That was the name she carried with her across the ocean, folded deeper into her than any uniform she had worn. The ship groaned as it cut through water that stretched endlessly, a gray skin torn only by the wake behind them. For days, then weeks, the horizon never changed. It did not care about flags or empires or surrender. It simply existed, wide and indifferent. Around her, the other women shifted through sickness, hunger, and a strange anticipation none of them dared to voice. Some prayed, some cursed, most remained silent. They all feared what waited on the other side. They had been told America was a land of demons with civilized disguises, a place where cruelty hid behind smiles, where prisoners disappeared into labor camps or laboratories, never to return. Even now, after everything she had seen, a part of her clung to that belief, because if what they had taught her was false, then the foundation of her life cracked with it. And she did not yet know how to stand on broken ground. When land finally appeared, it did not announce itself with grandeur. It rose slowly from the haze like a quiet disbelief. The coastline was not scarred. No skeletons of buildings reached for broken clouds. No smoke lingered. It was simply land. And beyond it, cities that stood intact, standing tall and indifferent to the storms that had swallowed her world. She stood at the rail, fingers gripping the cold metal, refusing to blink. This was supposed to be enemy territory. Yet the harbor bustled with life that did not resemble revenge. Workers unloaded crates, laughing among themselves. Cranes moved with mechanical patience. The air smelled not of ash or decay, but of oil, salt, and something faintly sweet drifting from a distant bakery. When they were led onto the dock, her legs nearly buckled, but not from fear, from disorientation. The ground did not feel right beneath her. It felt too solid, too secure, as if it had never known bombs. They were herded onto buses with curt efficiency, but no cruelty. Through wide windows she saw streets lined with buildings that stood whole. No missing walls, no roofs torn open, just signs hanging above storefronts, most of them filled with goods she had only seen in propaganda films. Shelves stocked, windows clear, lights burning even during daylight. Her breath tightened as the bus passed a grocery store. Inside, rows of bread loaves rested like obedient soldiers, fruit piled high, meat displayed openly without shame or ration tickets. Women pushed carts with children beside them, not in search of scraps, but shopping as if war existed only on another planet. The sight filled her not with wonder, but a sharp, burning resentment. The bus rolled on, passing farms that sprawled endlessly across the landscape. Fields of crops stretched further than her eyes could follow. Cattle moved lazily under a sun that had not been darkened by smoke. The wind carried the scent of soil and grass, not burned cities. This, they had said, was the barbaric world. She felt something twist inside her, not jealousy, not anger alone, but confusion so deep it made her feel hollow. How could the enemy be whole while her country lay shattered? How could their children grow up with full stomachs while hers staggered through ashes? It felt like an insult written across the land itself. Yet they had no choice but to pass through it. The buses finally slowed when rows of fences came into view. Barbed wire again, guard towers, a new captivity. Except this one stood surrounded not by ruin, but by life. The contrast mocked her. As they stepped out, she noticed how carefully even this camp had been placed, the ground leveled, barracks aligned with precision, no hasty construction, no desperate improvisation. Everything stood with intentional order. It felt like being imprisoned inside a country that functioned too well to care about her presence. A guard directed them forward. His voice was firm but plain, not cruel, not kind, just procedural. Behind the fence, beyond the controlled perimeter, she could still see a distant town, a church steeple, a water tower, children riding bicycles along a road that had not been scarred by explosions. Somewhere she could see a farmhouse with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. A peaceful column of smoke. She lowered her eyes, because looking too long made something dangerous rise in her chest. A thought she had been trained never to allow. Not hatred, not loyalty, but envy. And with it, the unbearable realization that the land she had been taught to despise had never needed to become what they had claimed. It had simply continued living. And so had she, though she did not understand how. The first morning inside the ranch camp began with the chirp of crickets and the rustle of dry leaves, not the scream of boots or the crack of commands. A bell rang somewhere in the distance, not sharp, not urgent, just a note to mark the passing of time. She sat up on a cot that didn't groan beneath her weight. Sheets tucked in with military precision, a thin blanket that held warmth, not warning. She blinked at the wooden slats of the ceiling above her and felt that unbearable tension, not from pain, but from ease. Something inside her resisted it. Outside, the camp stirred with a strange rhythm. No chaos, no drills, just motion. Women lined up for roll call not out of fear, but habit. The guards watched but didn't leer. They held rifles like tools, not threats. Afterward, the prisoners were assigned duties, not orders, not punishments, just tasks. She was given sewing. Another was sent to help with livestock. A few were asked to assist in the kitchens. At first, she thought it was a test. She checked the seams of the work clothes twice for hidden meanings, waited for the slap that never came. But the hours passed with no cruelty, only routine. The sewing room was tucked inside a small wooden structure beside the barn. Dust floated in the sunbeams like memory. She took her place beside a table with worn scissors, spools of thread, and piles of torn uniforms, American ones. She stitched slowly, carefully, fingers remembering muscle memory that had once belonged to service and duty. Now it belonged to something else she could not name. At lunch, the bell rang again. She stood in line, stomach clenched, not from hunger but anticipation. The mess hall smelled of fried potatoes and something savory she couldn't name. A plate was handed to her. The food was hot, balanced, enough. And again, no jeering, no eyes watching for a mistake to punish. The other women sat in rows, chewing slowly, glancing at one another as if waiting for the illusion to break. But it didn't. Day after day the routine repeated. Work, food, rest. She began tending to livestock, feeding chickens, collecting eggs. The warmth of a hen beneath her palm felt real in a way nothing had in months. A cowboy showed her how to scatter feed with a flick of the wrist. He didn't speak but nodded, demonstrating twice until she mimicked it well enough to earn a soft grunt of approval. The simplicity of it, this exchange, this rhythm, unsettled her more than violence ever could have. Because it was fair, and fairness was not what she had been trained to expect. Back in training, justice was measured in loyalty. Dignity was earned through pain. Here it seemed to be handed out without agenda. The American guards didn't ask for thanks. They didn't even look long enough to require it. She watched the other women adjust in different ways. Some softened quickly, falling into routine with grateful silence. Others resisted, walking stiffly, refusing to meet the guard's eyes. She drifted somewhere between them, silent but attentive. Every time she was handed something, a spool of thread, a tray of food, a bar of soap, something inside her recoiled. Because fairness, when offered by the enemy, felt like betrayal, not of them, of herself. She remembered a corporal who once told her, "If the Americans don't kill you, they'll make you forget who you are." She hadn't believed him. Now she wondered if forgetting wasn't being forced, but offered, in the softness of a bed, in the scent of fried onions, in the rhythm of days that asked for effort but not allegiance. And that was the most dangerous part. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like mercy, and she didn't know what to do with it. Every morning, before the bell rang, before the chickens stirred and before the heat crawled over the Texas soil, she saw him. Through the cracked window of the barracks kitchen, the same cowboy, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands already buried in a mound of flour. He moved with unhurried confidence, as if time obeyed his rhythm, not the other way around. The first time she saw him, she paused, unseen, half-shadowed behind a curtain. She expected gruffness, noise, but all she heard was the low creak of the wooden table and the soft slap of dough meeting palm. It became a ritual, not just his, hers. Each day, while others shuffled into work, she found an excuse to linger near the kitchen, just for a glimpse, just to see his hands transform raw ingredients into something warm. It wasn't the act of cooking that stunned her. It was the care, the tenderness. His back hunched slightly as he leaned into the task, flour dust catching in the morning sun like tiny ghosts. This man, who wore a sidearm and a badge stitched onto his shirt, looked more like a caretaker than a captor. The bread came out just before midday, placed on trays lined with cloth, golden and uneven. They did not slice it mechanically. They tore it, handed it out with real butter, even sometimes a smear of jam if the trucks had come through recently. She had grown up with rice, with pickled plums, with miso boiled on weak stoves. Bread had always been foreign, a Western food, alien and unnecessary. But here, it was not just nourishment, it was disarmament. The first time she took a piece into her hand, she hesitated. It was still warm, steam curling from its edges like breath. Her fingers sank slightly into its softness. She bit, and the crust crackled, giving way to a center so tender she forgot, for a moment, that she was wearing prison-issued clothes. This was not what the films had shown, and that was the problem. Everything she had been told about the Americans, their barbarism, their hunger for domination, their disregard for honor, fell apart under the weight of bread that had been made not in haste, but with patience. Food was not neutral. It carried meaning, culture, power. Back home, food had become an act of war. Every grain of rice measured, every bowl rationed, every meal prepared with tension. Here, meals seemed generous, not in excess, but in spirit. The contradiction gnawed at her more than hunger ever had, and that was what undid her most. Not propaganda, not philosophy, not bullets, but presence. Every morning, while the flour dust curled in the air like incense, she watched him turn dough into sustenance. No flag waved above him, no anthem played. Just the hum of the oven, the thud of heels on wood, and the slow breaking of everything she thought she knew. She had once believed strength came from steel, from discipline, from sacrifice. But here, strength smelled like bread. It softened corners. It made silence safe. It made her question whether the enemy she had trained to hate had ever truly existed, or if he had only ever been a shadow cast on a wall by men too afraid of gentleness. And so, as the days passed and the bread was served again and again, she found herself accepting it faster, holding it longer, tasting it fully, not just as food, but as a weapon she no longer had the will to resist. And that surrender, this quiet one, confused her more than the moment she had stepped forward with empty hands on the battlefield. No rifles were pointed at her here, no orders barked, yet something inside her was being dismantled more completely than any bombed city. It didn't come through explosions or blood, but through silence, through comfort, through the unbearable contrast between what she had believed and what she now lived. Her thoughts no longer moved in lines, but in uneasy spirals, around questions she had been trained never to ask. If the enemy feeds me, what does that make my commanders? If the enemy treats me like a person, what does that say about the men who taught me how to hate? And if captivity feels less cruel than freedom once did, then what, in truth, was honor? The questions didn't arrive all at once. They seeped in slowly between chores, between bites of buttered bread, between the warm hum of dusk and the quiet discipline of sunrise. Her hands moved through work, mending seams, tending hens, washing metal trays. But her mind was no longer her own. The old answers didn't fit. They had grown brittle. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling's wooden beams, listening to the breathing of women beside her. Most of them never spoke of their thoughts, but she knew they felt it too. This strange dissonance between what was and what was supposed to be. The whispers started in the dark, hesitant as wind through leaves. One woman confessed she had expected to be paraded through the streets in chains. Another admitted she thought they would be sterilized. "They say Americans do that," she whispered, "to weaken the race." No one contradicted her, but no one had seen it happen either. Instead, they were handed soap, slices of bread, sometimes second helpings of stew. The older women clung to suspicion, reminding the younger ones not to be fooled. "It's strategy," one said. "They want us to betray our country with our stomachs." But the younger ones weren't so sure anymore. They saw things the propaganda never mentioned: the guards who tied their boots with care, the nurses who folded towels instead of throwing them, the cook who hummed lullabies while slicing vegetables. Kindness wasn't supposed to be part of war, and yet here it was, persistent, unsettling, and quiet. More than once, she found herself pausing in the middle of her routine, staring at her own hands, wondering if they had changed, if they belonged to someone new now. The most terrifying realization wasn't that the enemy was human. It was that she was still capable of changing, that the world was wider than the one built for her in classrooms and training camps. And that realization, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of the real war. Not between nations, but within herself. A war with no map, no flag, no victory. Only the slow, grinding effort of questioning who she had been and who she was becoming, and the silent hope that when the dust finally settled, she might be able to live with the answer. The first letter arrived on a gray afternoon, folded thin from distance and time, passed through hands that had pressed official stamps and measured words for danger. It carried her mother's writing, smaller now, as though each character had lost weight with the city. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, not from kitchens, but from ruins. She recognized it immediately, the scent of home as it had become, not as it once was. She held it without opening it for several minutes. Around her, the other women gathered at the table, each receiving envelopes of similar fragility, some trembling as they tore them open, others refusing to touch them at all. Letters were strange weapons. They could nourish or destroy you, sometimes both at once. The camp authorities allowed correspondence under careful rules. No information about camp location, no military detail, no mention of procedures or conditions that could be exploited. In theory, censorship was to protect both sides. In reality, the most brutal censor was not American. It lived inside her own chest. Her mother wrote of broken streets and borrowed rice, of neighbors gone and neighbors changed, of the sky that sometimes still burned at night even though the war was supposed to be ending. She wrote of ration queues that curved around corners like funeral processions, and of rumors that never settled. But she also wrote that her daughter's name was still placed on the altar each morning, that she lit incense for her survival, that even disgrace would be endured if it brought her back breathing. The words struck harder than any accusation ever could. She folded the letter slowly, hands careful, as though it might tear under too much truth. And it was then she knew she could not tell her mother everything, not because someone would stop her, but because she could not bear what her own honesty would do. How could she write about bread, about warmth, about being fed by men whose boots her mother had been told to fear since before the first air raid? How could she confess that she no longer knew how to hate them the way she had once sworn she would? So she began to write. The pencil felt heavier than the scalpel she once carried, each word chosen like thread, meant to hold without breaking. She wrote that she was safe, that she had work, that she helped prepare food and mend clothing. She wrote that her health remained stable. She wrote that she hoped to return when allowed. She wrote enough to keep her mother's heart beating, and not a line more. She did not write about the bread. She did not write about the cowboy. She did not write about the feeling of waking to birds instead of sirens, because to write it would feel like betrayal, not of the Americans, but of the world her mother still lived inside, a world where such kindness would sound like fantasy, or worse, like weakness. She watched the other women struggle at the same tables. Some scribbled with urgency, heads bent low, tears smudging their ink. Others sat with blank pages for hours, unable to begin. A few tore their sheets completely, choosing silence over compromise. Silence, she realized, had its own cost. Every unsaid truth settled somewhere behind her ribs, heavy, quiet, undeniable, and yet she carried it, because she believed for a long time that this burden was the last thing tying her to honor, not the honor she had been taught, but a smaller, quieter one, the kind that chose not to disturb the fragile worlds of those who could not yet understand. She imagined her mother reading a letter that spoke of warm bread served by American hands. She imagined the confusion, the disbelief, the pain. She imagined how it might shatter the carefully rebuilt sense of enemy and ally that people clung to in ruins. And she could not do it. So her letters became carefully edited versions of herself, a shadow self, a softer truth that left the hardest parts untouched. Each time she sealed an envelope, she felt both relief and guilt. Relief that she had protected something, guilt that she had protected a lie. And as she placed her finished letter into the outgoing basket and watched it disappear into institutional hands, she wondered how many wars had been fueled not by what was spoken, but by what people believed they could never write. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with weapons or voices, they are fought on blank paper, between truth and mercy. And if you're finding this story powerful so far, hit like and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. In the final months of the war, something began to shift, not with a loud declaration or a change in orders, but with the subtle erosion of what once felt absolute. The fences remained, the gates were still locked, but inside the camp, the world softened. Rules bent without breaking, schedules loosened, conversations drifted past what had once been considered safe. The war was not over, but it was unraveling, and with its unraveling came the quiet return of something the prisoners had not felt in years: choice. She noticed it first in the way the guards walked, less stiff, less rehearsed. One of them, a younger man with dust on his collar and a cigarette always perched behind his ear, began tipping his hat to the women when they passed. Another started leaving small offerings beside the sewing table: a stack of unused cloth, a small tin of buttons, a sewing needle polished with care. No one spoke about it. That would have broken the spell. But it was there, the slow recognition of each other as more than function, more than role. Even the cowboy, the one who baked bread with hands that could cradle or crush, seemed changed. He began to linger a little longer during chores, standing beside the women not to oversee them, but to work alongside them. Sometimes he'd lift heavy feed sacks before they asked. Other times he'd let them show him a different way of folding fabric or fixing a fence post. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, just shared space, shared silence, and in that silence bloomed something fragile: dignity. One morning the gate to the pasture creaked open earlier than usual, and they were told they could walk the edge of the field for air. No armed escort hovered close. The fence still stood, but suddenly it seemed less like a barrier and more like a relic from another life. She stepped out and felt the grass under her shoes. Real grass, untamed and wild. The wind carried the scent of horses, dry earth, and something else she hadn't known she'd missed: space. Not just to move, but to be. She walked alongside another woman, one who had barely spoken since arriving at the camp. They didn't exchange words, but their pace aligned naturally. When they reached the far edge of the property, they both paused and looked out. Beyond the fence was more land, stretching toward the horizon in waves of gold and green. It was the first time in months she allowed herself to imagine life beyond confinement. Not escape, not even freedom. Just life, stillness without fear. Later that week, while fixing a fence with the cowboy, she watched him pause, wipe his brow, and say, "Hot one today." She nodded. He offered a canteen. She drank. No power shifted in that moment, no boundaries broke, but something passed between them, a mutual unspoken acknowledgment that they were no longer entirely enemies. They were two people enduring the same sun, the same work, the same waiting. Inside the barracks, the change was felt too. The women stood a little straighter, laughed a little more freely. One even began humming while she mended uniforms. Small things, but they mattered because they were theirs. Dignity, they learned, didn't require rank or uniform. It required only the permission to feel human again. And perhaps, in the end, that was what the war could not erase. Not entirely. The fence could hold bodies, it could hold names, but it could not hold the subtle return of a personhood too quiet for headlines and too persistent to kill. When the gates finally opened for her return, there was no trumpet, no ceremony, no apology written into law. Only a list of names called in a flat voice, paperwork stamped, and a final bus ride beyond the lands that had somehow dismantled her without ever touching her. The ranch disappeared into dust behind her, its fields folding back into the horizon as though it had only been a season of dream. The cowboy never waved. He only nodded once, the same way he had the first morning she had seen him kneading dough, and she understood that was his farewell. Not grand, not sentimental, just real. The ship back crossed a different ocean, though the water was the same. She did not feel the same. When Japan reappeared through mist and smog, it looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually, as if the war had hollowed the land and left only a fragile shell for its people to occupy. The port was quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion. A silence born from too much loss to explain. Her city no longer resembled a city. Streets once familiar curved around absence. Where homes had stood were now stretches of blackened earth, tangled wires, and improvised shelters built from scrap wood and salvage metal. The air carried the faint, permanent scent of ash. No one noticed her arrival. No one had the strength to. Everyone walked with their eyes lowered, as if looking up might reveal how much had been taken. Her mother lived in half a room that had once been part of a larger house. When they embraced, there was no sobbing, only a long, silent hold where their spines pressed together as if making sure the other was still solid. Her mother's hair had silvered completely. Her hands trembled, but they were warm, alive. She never spoke of the camp, not the bread, not the kindness, not the farmland so vast it made her feel small in a way that wasn't cruel. Those memories she folded carefully inside herself, like linens stored for a season that might never return. Life became survival. She worked in clinics with broken windows. She patched wounds with limited supplies. She queued for rice that came thin and inconsistent. Japan did not rebuild loudly. It rebuilt in fragments, slowly, with hands that had forgotten how to dream. Years passed, slipping through seasons that blurred together. Cold winters, humid summers, springs without blossoms because no one had replanted them yet. The war became something people spoke of in quieter tones, as if raising their voices might wake the dead. Yet some nights, when the power flickered and the city slept tense around her, she would catch a phantom scent. Yeast, heat, something faintly sweet. Bread, and the memory would return, not as pain, but as a quiet weight resting on her chest. Not heavy, not light, simply present. The first time she tried to bake, she had no recipe. There were no books for that, no teachers, only the ghost of his hands from across an ocean. She mixed flour she had saved from weeks of rationing, warmed water over a weak stove, added salt sparingly. The dough was stubborn. It didn't rise the way she remembered the ranch loaves had. She waited longer, then longer still. When she pushed her palms into it, she felt her breath slow. The movement stirred something unspoken in her bones. Press, fold, turn, the same rhythm. When the oven finally released its heat and she pulled out a misshapen little loaf, uneven, cracked, barely browned, she didn't taste it right away. She let it sit in her hands, warming her palms. And for a moment, the walls of her small room fell away. The ash-stained skyline faded. She was back there, not as a prisoner, but as someone witnessing a truth too quiet to make the history books. She bit into it. It did not taste like his bread. It was heavier, simpler, born from scarcity, not abundance, but it carried something else, a memory, a defiance, a refusal to allow the war to be the only story her life told. From then on, she baked when she could, on birthdays, on no days at all. She never explained it to anyone. The neighbors saw Western food and thought it strange, but they never asked, and she never offered. It was her rebellion, not against Japan, not against America, but against the lie that war had claimed over meaning. And every time that faint smell spread through her small room, she remembered that once, in a land she had been taught to hate, someone had fed her not to own her, not to erase her, but simply because she was human. And if this story stayed with you, like the scent of bread in a quiet room, like this video and comment below, where are you watching from, and what moment hit you most?